Welcome to our channel, where we share true stories of justice, courage, and timeless values that must never be forgotten. If you believe that old-fashioned virtues, like memory, justice, and bravery, still have a place in today's world, then the story of Mr. Samuel Whitaker is sure to touch your heart. Don't forget to like this video, share it with those who cherish family legacy, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the powerful stories of perseverance and the triumph of what is right. Every share you make is a step toward protecting justice and preserving heritage. Seabreeze Hollow is a place where time seems to move more slowly. Winding roads curve gently through golden sand dunes where the ocean waves endlessly lap the shore, and each evening the sunset stretches across the sky like a brilliant orange ribbon. It is here, on a quiet patch of land overlooking the sea, that Samuel Whitaker has spent nearly his entire life, not because of the scenery or modern conveniences, but because of one thing he has always cherished more than anything else: an old wooden barn built in 1918 by his great-grandfather. The barn was unlike any other structure in the neighborhood. It stood silently among the salt-touched coastal grass, like a century-old guardian. Sea winds had faded the wood panels outside, but inside, everything remained untouched, a time capsule of memories. It had once housed his grandfather's fishing gear, served as the place where his father learned to mend nets, and was where Samuel himself had fixed his first radio with his late older brother. Every corner of the barn held a memory, from tiny handprints carved into the rafters to an old bicycle hanging from an iron hook, as if the barn itself knew how to tell stories. Samuel had never once considered leaving Seabreeze Hollow. In a world that constantly rushes forward and forgets easily, he saw himself as the keeper of his family's memories, and the barn was the most tangible part of that legacy. More than once, neighbors had suggested he tear it down to make space for a beachfront lounge or a modern garage, but he always shook his head. Some things aren't meant to be traded for convenience, especially when they carry the blood of your own family, he once told his youngest granddaughter. One April morning, after a few days visiting relatives in Eugene, Samuel returned home. He drove down the sand-covered driveway, his heart quickening as the horizon came into view, the place where the barn had always greeted him like an old friend. But this time, there was nothing there. He stopped the car in the middle of the yard, opened the door, and stepped out slowly. The land where the barn once stood was now a barren, lifeless patch of ground, littered with splintered wood, crumbling plaster, and rusted nails. The very things that had been carefully maintained and lovingly preserved for over a century now lay in ruin, the remains of memory. Samuel stood frozen, the ocean wind tugging at his silver hair. The chill he felt didn't come from the weather. It came from somewhere deep inside, the cold of loss, the shock of something stolen without warning. There had been no warning signs, no official letters, no phone calls, nothing. It had all happened in silence, as if the barn had never existed. And in that silence, Samuel felt an unspoken betrayal creeping through the land he had always called home. When neighbors approached, their expressions were hesitant, apologetic. Some said they'd seen workers come in and assumed it was part of a renovation Samuel had approved. Others muttered, "Must have been a decision by the HOA. They did mention landscaping changes in a recent meeting." But Samuel had never been invited to any meeting. He had never signed any agreement. He bent down and picked up a broken wooden sign, the one his granddaughter had once painted with care. The Whitaker Barn, established. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment. Time seemed to pause, but inside him, something was stirring, a new resolve beginning to take shape. If they could destroy his family's history without even asking, what else might they take next? And as the ocean winds picked up that late afternoon, Samuel understood something with absolute clarity. This fight was no longer just about the barn. It was about honor, memory, and the right to what is his. And it had only just begun. Mr. Samuel's story has only just begun. What you've seen so far is merely the tip of the iceberg of injustice. If you feel anger, emotion, or a deep sense of empathy, then don't look away. Hit the like button, share this video with those who value the truth, and subscribe to our channel today to follow part 2, when the darkness begins to reveal itself. You won't want to miss the intense events that lie ahead. The silence after the demolition lingered like an unhealed wound. For days, Samuel Whitaker sat by the window of his wooden house, staring out at the empty patch of land where the century-old barn once stood. He didn't speak a word. Neighbors walking by avoided eye contact. No one dared to ask, and no one knew how to begin. But within that silence, one question kept echoing in his mind. Who gave permission for this to happen? Everything had happened too quickly, too quietly, and too perfectly to be a simple mistake. Samuel began reviewing every document, letter, and email, any form of notification he might have missed. He opened old envelopes, reread notes from previous community meetings he had attended, but there was no record, no announcement, and no resolution that ever mentioned tearing down the barn. The more he searched, the more he sensed something was deliberately being hidden. On a Monday morning, Samuel made his way to the Seabreeze Hollow Homeowners Association office, an institution widely known to be ruled by Karen, the HOA president, a woman notorious for her strict enforcement of community aesthetics. She had once forced a family to repaint their fence because it was too bright, and made an elderly couple remove their wooden swing because it didn't match the landscape. But no one had ever witnessed anything as extreme as this, demolishing a historic structure without the owner's consent. At the office, Samuel asked to see the meeting records related to the barn's demolition. A young receptionist hesitated, fumbled through the computer, and then disappeared into the back room. Minutes later, Karen herself appeared, wearing a thin, brittle smile and eyes as cold as ice. "Mr. Whitaker, we believe the barn was abandoned and in a state of serious disrepair," she said, her tone devoid of remorse. "We acted in the interest of community safety." "Abandoned?" Samuel's jaw clenched. "I maintain that barn every week. I fix the roof, repaint the walls. It's a part of history. It's legally owned by my family." Karen's expression didn't change. "I'm sorry, but you were not present during the special committee meeting. A vote was taken, and the decision was made." "A vote? What meeting? I never received any notice." "We posted the meeting notice on the bulletin board outside the office," she replied curtly. But Samuel knew that board well. It was mounted behind the building, rarely visited by anyone. And according to HOA's own regulations, any proposal involving changes to privately owned property must be delivered directly to the homeowner in writing. Samuel left the office empty-handed, but filled with suspicion. The next day, he reached out to Clara Reynolds, a young attorney who had recently moved to Seabreeze Hollow. They had once spoken at the local bookstore, where she had mentioned her interest in property rights cases. After hearing his story, Clara paused in thoughtful silence, then said gently, "If you'll let me, I want to help you investigate. Something about this doesn't sit right." With Clara's help, Samuel began gathering evidence. They discovered that the special HOA meeting had no official minutes, and the attendance list included only 3 individuals, all closely affiliated with Karen. There were no legal representatives, no notices sent to residents, and absolutely no photos, recordings, or documented demolition plans. Everything had taken place in secret, hastily, and unlawfully. What caught Clara's particular attention was an invoice from Pine Coast Demolition, the company that carried out the teardown. The payment was not directed to the HOA account, but rather to a private account under a nonprofit organization where Karen had previously served as a board advisor. A clear sign of conflict of interest, if not outright corruption. The truth began to emerge like fog lifting from the sea. This wasn't just a poor decision. It was a coordinated, deliberate violation of property rights, meticulously planned to bypass regulations and oversight. And in that moment, Samuel realized he was no longer just facing a heartless decision. He was confronting a system fueled by control and unchecked authority. Samuel's outrage was no longer a personal grievance. It had become a declaration of war. He had always been a quiet man, someone who avoided conflict and believed in resolving matters peacefully. But this time was different. The barn wasn't just timber and nails. It was a symbol of pride, a witness to 3 generations, and a representation of everything he believed in. And when it was erased in silence, without even a word of consultation, he knew. If he didn't stand up, who would be next? Clara Reynolds, with her dedication and sharp instincts, became an indispensable ally. Together, They combed through every bylaw of the Sea Breeze Hollow HOA, from internal policies to regulations ratified by the state of Oregon. The conclusion was clear. Karen and the board had acted illegally. Not only had they violated Samuel's legal property rights, but they had also carried out the demolition without any process of compensation or agreement. Every sign pointed to an arbitrary and opaque decision. Clara drafted a lawsuit, not only demanding full compensation for damages, but also calling for the HOA to issue a public apology and accept accountability before the community. Samuel signed the document, his hand trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. This was no longer personal. It was a battle of principle against unchecked authority. News of the lawsuit spread quickly through the community. At first, many residents were hesitant. They feared confronting the HOA, long seen as the gatekeepers of neighborhood order. But as Clara began presenting facts, the lack of meeting records, questionable payment invoices, and Karen's ties to the demolition company, fear gave way to suspicion, and suspicion turned into anger. Samuel began receiving notes slipped under his door, handwritten messages from neighbors. "We support you. You're not alone. Thank you for standing up." A young couple, once fined by the HOA for hanging a flag on their porch, came to tell him about their experience being intimidated for violating community standards. A single mother recounted how she was forced to remove her child's plastic slide because it was deemed an eyesore. These stories transformed Samuel from a lone plaintiff into a collective voice of resistance. The lawsuit was filed with the Clatsop County Court. Karen responded by hiring a high-profile law firm from Portland to defend her case, lawyers in dark suits with confident strides. Their argument was simple. The barn was a deteriorating structure, a threat to public safety, and the HOA had the right to act in emergencies. But Clara was prepared. She presented photographs of the barn taken shortly before the demolition, showing a newly repaired roof, freshly painted walls, and no visible signs of collapse or decay. The most devastating blow came from evidence Clara hadn't expected to receive, a secret audio recording from the very meeting where the demolition was decided, anonymously sent to her email by a board member who chose to remain unnamed. In the recording, Karen's voice rang out clearly. "That barn is an eyesore. If he won't take it down, then we'll do it for him." The courtroom fell silent as the recording ended. Samuel turned to Clara, his expression calm, but his jaw clenched, not from anxiety, but because he knew the truth had finally come to light. The case was no longer a property dispute. It had become a moral trial, where one elderly resident was holding an entire system accountable for overstepping its bounds. And although the outcome remained uncertain, Samuel understood one thing with clarity. This fight was necessary, and he had done the right thing. As the trial entered its second week, the tension inside the courtroom was palpable. Every seat was filled, not just with residents of Sea Breeze Hollow, but also with reporters from local news stations and representatives from property rights organizations. What had once seemed like a minor neighborhood dispute between an elderly homeowner and the HOA board had now become the center of a much larger debate. Where does the power of a homeowners association end, and who holds them accountable? Karen maintained her cold demeanor, her face unreadable, even as she faced the audio recording that directly implicated her. She claimed the recording had been edited, taken out of context, and did not prove any specific illegal behavior. But the expressions of the jury were beginning to shift, from indifferent to skeptical, and the unwavering testimony of Samuel, backed by Clara's solid evidence, began to turn the tide. Clara didn't stop there. On a quiet weekend afternoon, she visited Michael Baird, a former board member who had quietly resigned 3 months earlier. At first, he avoided the subject, saying he didn't want to get involved in old business. But when Clara placed a folder in front of him, containing financial records linking Karen to Pine Coast demolition, his silence cracked under the weight of his conscience. A few days later, Michael appeared in court as a witness. He admitted that Karen had orchestrated an illegal meeting, bypassing the required community consultation process and intentionally keeping the decision hidden from residents. With a slow but steady voice, he recounted instances of being pressured and even threatened with reputation damage if he didn't go along with her directives. His courage sent a ripple through the courtroom. Truth was now breaking through layers of deceit. Karen's legal team tried to fight back by shifting the narrative. They presented old photographs from 2017 showing the barn's roof damaged after a storm, claiming that it was grounds for demolition. But Clara had come prepared. She produced a notarized maintenance report, proving that Samuel had fully repaired the roof using storm-resistant materials, certified by a local engineer. Every diversion attempt was met with clear, factual rebuttals, one after another, as steady and unshakable as the life Samuel had always lived, honest and resolute. The climax came when Clara revealed a bombshell, an internal email exchange between Karen and the demolition company submitted anonymously by a Pine Coast employee after reading about the trial. In the email, Karen wrote, "We need to move fast before the old man comes back. We can use his safety concerns to legitimize the decision." There was no denying it. No more arguments to be made. The courtroom fell silent, not out of disbelief, but out of sheer shock at the blatant abuse of power laid bare. Samuel didn't raise his head in triumph. Instead, he looked down at his hands, the same hands that once hammered shingles, wiped down the barn's windows, and carved his granddaughter's name into the gate. He didn't need victory for the applause. He only needed the truth to be restored, like the wooden roof that had sheltered 3 generations before him. Karen, for the first time since the trial began, avoided eye contact with anyone in the room. She slumped into her chair, hands folded tightly in her lap, like someone finally being swallowed by the very storm she had created. Her lawyers whispered urgently beside her, but it was too late. No one could erase what had just been seen and heard. The truth was out, and it was far too clear to be hidden again. The residents of Seabreeze Hollow left the courthouse that day in silence, but something in their eyes had changed. Within that quiet was a collective acknowledgement, a shared realization that justice was finally tipping in favor of a man they once saw as merely a stubborn old soul clinging to the past. But now they understood. He had been the only one who saw what the future might look like if no one dared to stand up. The day the verdict was delivered, the skies over Seabreeze Hollow were gray, as if the entire coastline was holding its breath. But inside the courtroom, a beam of sunlight streamed through the window, falling softly across Samuel Whitaker's shoulder. In that moment, he didn't look like a man fighting for property. He looked like a guardian of memory, a figure from another era, standing for an entire generation long past. The judge rose, his voice calm but clear, like the sound of a morning bell. This court finds that the Seabreeze Hollow Homeowners Association has committed serious violations of legal property rights, abused its governing authority, and failed to follow required legal procedures in the demolition of the plaintiff's structure, Mr. Samuel Whitaker. The ruling included a full financial settlement, covering the cost to rebuild the barn, emotional damages, and a public apology the HOA was ordered to issue before the entire community. But more importantly, the court mandated a leadership review within the HOA and ordered Karen to immediately step down as president. In that moment, Samuel didn't smile. He didn't clap. He simply exhaled, a breath he had been holding for months. Clara placed a hand gently on his shoulder and whispered, "We did it, Mr. Whitaker." He nodded, saying nothing more, because the greatest victory wasn't the compensation. It was the recognition that memory, loyalty, and truth still have a place in a world that so often forgets them. News of the verdict spread like wildfire on the ocean breeze. Local newspapers ran bold headlines. 73-year-old man wins lawsuit against HOA, reclaims family legacy. A national network reached out for an interview, but Samuel declined. "I didn't do this for attention," he told Clara. "I just did the right thing." 1 week after the trial, Samuel stood before the land where the barn once stood. The Pacific wind rustled through the freshly framed rafters, carrying the scent of red pine, the same scent from 1918. With the compensation money, he had hired a local crew of builders, but his only request was simple: don't change the design. Every nail, every window, exactly as it was. Don't change the design. Every nail, every window, exactly as it was. Neighbors came by to watch. Some brought tools, others brought cookies, coffee, even folding chairs to sit and talk. No one called him a stubborn old man anymore. Now, he was the man who reminded the entire community, no progress is worth erasing the past. Clara received offers from several law firms, but she chose to stay in Seabreeze Hollow. "This place needs someone like you," she told Samuel, as they together mounted a new plaque at the barn's entrance. The Whitaker Barn, built 1918, rebuilt 2025, preserved by truth. Karen vanished from the community like a puff of smoke. Those who once supported her either went quiet or joined the new HOA reform group. A new election was held, the first one with widespread resident participation, driven by demands for transparency, limits on power, and real accountability. Seabreeze Hollow had changed, not because Samuel called for a revolution, but because he had the courage to say no. One summer afternoon, Samuel sat inside the rebuilt barn. Sunlight filtered through the wooden window frame, casting golden rays on his grandfather's old workbench. The vintage radio played soft jazz from the 1940s. Outside, his granddaughter Ellie was coloring on the wooden floor, the same spot where Samuel had once carved his name at age 7. He looked at the scene with eyes that were bright, yet deep, the gaze of someone who knew he couldn't keep everything forever, but could protect what mattered most from being swept away. And that he had done, not just for himself, but for the generations to come. Autumn arrived gently in Seabreeze Hollow. The coastal poplar trees turned a soft shade of yellow, and the Pacific breeze carried a crisp chill, as if even the seasons had slowed down to admire what had been restored. On the small patch of land that once lay barren after the demolition, Samuel Whitaker's barn now stood strong again, not merely as a reconstructed building, but as a reborn symbol. That morning, Samuel rose early. He put on a thick brown sweater, stepped out of his house with a cup of coffee in one hand and an old folding chair in the other. There was no rush. Time was no longer his adversary, but his companion. The barn before him still smelled of new wood, but it held the soul of the old one, from the recreated window frames to the wooden plaque lovingly restored by his granddaughter's hands. That plaque now gleamed in the morning light. The Whitaker Barn, built 1918, rebuilt 2025, preserved by truth. Samuel wasn't a man who cried easily, but that morning, when he heard the light footsteps of little Ellie running toward him, holding a drawing she had made, one that showed him, the barn, and the old oak tree beside it, a single tear quietly fell onto the hem of his sweater. Not out of sadness, but from something deeper, a sense of gratitude, of completeness, of peace. Soon after, the community of Seabreeze Hollow organized a small ceremony in front of the barn. Neighbors brought homemade pastries, warm cider, and even old photographs they had taken near the site over the years. Some shared stories, a wedding shoot beneath the tree canopy, teaching their kids to ride bikes down the gravel road. They hadn't realized it until now, but Samuel's barn had become part of their collective memory. Clara stood quietly off to the side, a gentle smile crossing her face. She knew she hadn't just helped recover a piece of property, she had helped awaken a sense of community that had long been asleep. After the ceremony, Samuel gave her a long, heartfelt hug. No words were needed. Between them was a trust that required no explanation. From that day forward, the barn opened its doors every weekend, not as a museum nor a tourist attraction, and certainly not for profit, but as a welcoming space for anyone who wished to reconnect with what they thought was lost: authenticity, resilience, and memory. Children sat on the wooden floor sketching. Elders shared stories of summers past, and new families who had recently moved in found a sense of connection they never expected. Months later, a group of local history students visited Samuel as part of a project called Living Heritage, documenting stories of historic structures preserved by everyday citizens. One student asked, "What do you think is the greatest value this barn holds?" Samuel paused for a moment, then replied, "It reminds me that the past never truly disappears. It just needs to be protected, with memory, with truth, and with the courage to stand up when it matters." That quote was later published on the project's website and quickly spread across social media. What began as a personal battle became an inspiration to others, in other towns, other neighborhoods, where old homes, barns, and picket fences faced the threat of being erased by indifference or greed. And as the sun sets each evening in Seabreeze Hollow, the golden light spills through the wooden windows of the old barn, and people still see Samuel sitting there, sometimes alone, sometimes with Ellie, sometimes with a curious visitor who's just stopped by. He doesn't retell the story often, but anyone who sees him knows this is the man who protected something the world too easily forgets, not just property, but dignity. Some battles in life don't begin with anger, but with a quiet sense of loss. The story of Samuel Whitaker is not simply about a property dispute. It's the journey of an ordinary man standing up to a system of power to protect something that seemed outdated and forgotten, an old wooden barn. But beneath every plank, behind every window frame, lies a lesson that any one of us, whether we live in a small town or a bustling city, can learn from and carry with us. The first lesson: some things cannot be measured in dollars. In a world constantly chasing the new, it's easy to think that the old is a burden, a roadblock to progress. But it's often those old things, family memories, ancestral traditions, and spaces filled with history that form the foundation of who we are. Samuel didn't fight to preserve a shed. He fought to preserve the memory of 3 generations. And in doing so, he reminds us, when we forget our roots, we lose a part of ourselves. Second, silence is never the answer in the face of injustice. Too often, when people witness wrongdoing, they think, "That's not my problem," or "What can one person do?" But it's precisely those thoughts that allow injustice to grow and take root. Samuel was a man in his 70s, living alone, with no influence or power behind him. But he chose not to stay silent. And once he spoke up, others, neighbors, a young lawyer, a former board member, found the courage to stand with him. One person's bravery became a wave that awakened an entire community. Third, justice doesn't just happen. It must be protected, often with quiet perseverance. Throughout the legal battle, Samuel was never angry, never vengeful. He was steady, kind, but unyielding. This shows us that justice doesn't come from noise, but from inner moral strength, from the resolve to stand for what is right, even if you're standing alone. In a world where everything moves quickly and values shift easily, the persistence to defend a single right thing may be the most revolutionary act of all. The final, and perhaps most profound lesson: what we protect today is not just for ourselves, but for the generations to come. When Samuel sat with his granddaughter in the newly rebuilt barn, that moment wasn't just about restoring a physical structure. It was a victory of memory, a bridge between past and future. We don't live only for today. We live to pass on a legacy, not just of land, but of spirit. The courage to stand, to preserve, and to believe that the good can prevail. In everyday life, we may never face a boardroom or have a barn to defend. But eventually, we will all stand before a choice: to preserve or to let go, to speak up or stay silent, to protect what is right or take the easier path. And in that moment, may we remember Samuel, the man who refused to let time erase what mattered most. Because sometimes, standing up for something small may be the most powerful way to make the world more worthy of living in. If the story of Samuel Whitaker has touched your heart, with its message of perseverance, justice, and family legacy, don't keep that feeling to yourself. Click like, share this video to spread its inspiring message even further, and subscribe to our channel to continue walking with us through more stories where ordinary people do extraordinary things. Every subscription is a reminder that truth and courage still have a place in this world.